Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jordan. Thank you so much for clicking on one of my bookish videos. Today I am going to be talking about my winter TBR, the books that I absolutely want to read this winter, as well as some of my recommendations for books that I think you should read and that I have personally loved. So stay tuned if you want to see the books on my winter TBR and some of my book recommendations for this winter. Okay, so we are going to start off with the books on my TBR this winter. A lot of these are books that are on my physical TBR that I'm really hoping to get through sooner than later, as well as a few new releases that I am so excited for and I cannot wait to get my hands on. So to start, I am hoping to read Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson this winter. This is the 5th book in the Stormlight Archive, and I was kindly gifted this book by Tor Books, so thank you very much to them. I currently still have to read Rhythm of War, which is the 4th book in the series, and then Wind and Truth, but I'm making it a goal to read this book in the winter this year to somehow push myself to get through these next 2 absolutely massive books. This is one of my favorite fantasy series now of all time. I'm absolutely in love with the characters and the magic system and world building that Sanderson has created in this series, and I've heard really good things about this final book in the first part of the series, so I'm super excited to get to it. Next on my winter TBR is First Time Caller by BK Borison, which is her first book in a new series. BK Borison is the author of the Lovelight Farm series. First Time Caller, I've heard such great things about from so many of my friends, and I am so excited to read it. I have a really good feeling. It is inspired by Sleepless in Seattle, which is one of my favorite movies, and I've heard that it's just a really well-written, slow burn book of longing, and that a lot of people love the male main character and the female main character, which I feel like is pretty rare sometimes in a romance. I'm super excited to read this one, and it comes out on February 11th. Next on my winter TBR is This Is How You Lose the Time War. This was sent to me by Saga Press Books, so thank you to them for the free book. This is a super short little fantasy book. I have wanted to read it for so long. I've heard amazing things. I know that it's a bit of like a time travel fantasy, and I believe a sapphic love story. So as short as it is, I feel like it's gonna somehow really hurt me and make me emotional, and I love that, and I hope it does. Next, and I think the book that I'm most excited for is Oathbound by Tracy Dion, which releases on March 4th. This is the 3rd book in the Legendborn Cycle series, and the first 2 books I read last year, which is Legendborn and Bloodmarked, and absolutely loved it. It is one of my favorite young adult fantasy series of all time. The world building, the main character, the ancestral and generational representation is just so good. It's just such a creative series. I've never really read a fantasy that revolves around King Arthur and that whole magic system. Bree is one of my favorite fantasy main characters of all time. I am scared to read the Oathbound, but I'm also so excited, and the second I get my hands on it, I will be absolutely eating it up because I cannot wait. Next on my TBR is Lovely War, and honestly, I don't know too much about this book, but I had originally seen Destiny Sidwell read this book and absolutely love it. I think it came to a shock to her because she hadn't really heard much of it, and then I think my friend Anna on Bookstagram absolutely loved this book, and that was what made me get it last year. What I do know about it is it's about World War II, but with like Greek gods and goddesses, and it's basically about like humans and fates and how humans can be like controlled and fall in love with the different gods and then cause different like major events. And yeah, I've just heard that it's a super emotional book and it has really, really beautiful writing, and I'm planning on reading this one soon, so I'm really excited to start. Okay, next up is Rebel Witch, which is the second book in the Crimson Moth duology after Heartless Hunter, which I read last year, and Rebel Witch is being released, I believe, on February 18th, and I am so excited. I listened to Heartless Hunter on audio, which I think was like an elite reading experience, and I'm honestly planning on listening to Rebel Witch because the audiobook narrator just made the tension between Rune and Gideon so good, and especially with all the different action that is occurring in this book, because it's definitely a very fast-paced young adult fantasy series. The audiobook was just a fantastic way to get immersed in the world. I'm really excited for Rebel Witch. It's leading off after a big blow up occurs between Rune and Gideon, and a lot of betrayal has happened, but I've heard really, really good things, and I've heard that the tension and the angst between these two somehow goes up another level in Rebel Witch. So yeah, I really think I'm going to enjoy that one. Next up is Promise Me Sunshine by Cara Bastone. This book was gifted to me by the Dial Press, so thank you to them. This is by the same author as Ready or Not, which was an accidental pregnancy book that I really enjoyed. Promise Me Sunshine is about a young woman who is dealing with the very fresh grief of losing her best friend. So she has a lot of trauma and just grief and a lot of emotions to deal with. And then I believe she meets the male main character and he kind of helps her go through this healing journey. I've just heard that the writing in this is so emotional and so beautiful, and it's a fantastic depiction of grief and loss, and I'm really excited. I think I'm going to annotate this one, hopefully. Okay, last book on my winter TBR is Before I Let Go by Kennedy Ryan. I have put off reading Kennedy Ryan's books for so long because I've heard that they are the most like emotionally jarring, heartbreaking books ever, which are my favorite books to read, especially with romance. However, I just need to read this series. I've only heard fantastic things. I've heard that Kennedy is so many people's favorite romance authors. I don't know much about this series, but again, I know that it's a very emotional and raw series and love story, and I'm super, super excited to read it. Okay, so we are now going to move on to the second part of this video, which is my winter book recommendations. These are books that I have read that I absolutely love, that honestly you can read any time of year, but for some reason they just scream this season. Quite a few of these I'm actually planning to reread as well this winter because I really just want to be back in my favorite worlds with my favorite characters. First and foremost is the Beartown series by Frederick Bachman. This is, along with Magnolia Parks, my favorite series and books of all time. As you can see, I have very heavily annotated this series when I first read it back in 2022. Just thinking about it, I'm literally tearing up right now. It absolutely ripped me apart. This is a series about hockey, and that sounds so stupid, and it does not even scratch the surface of all the different topics and themes in this book. And I will say, please make sure you check trigger warnings, especially before reading Beartown. There's a specific thing that occurs in Beartown that is kind of the basis for the book. As heartbreaking as this series is, it is the most beautifully written, uniquely written series I've ever read. Bachman just has such a great way of describing community. He writes grief and loss and trauma so wonderfully. He writes friendship and love and just finding yourself yourself and finding your purpose in life. The characters in this book are some of my favorite characters of all time. I think about them literally constantly, especially Benji. And I am planning to reread this series as well this year. I really have been thinking about doing it now since I read it in early 2022. I just need to be back with these characters. I want to be hurt again. I've been thinking about them constantly. So feel free to join me for a reread or a first read of the Beartown series this year. Okay, so another reread for me, which I actually just finished reading, is The Invisible Life of Addie Larue by V. Schwab. And if you want to see me reading this book, you can check out my last video, which was how much I read in a week. I love this book. I read it first in 2020 and I just reread it, and I can confidently tell you that 5 years later, it's still one of my favorite books. It is about a woman named Addie who essentially is immortal, is living through over 300 years of life, going about life where people forget her every time that essentially they lose sight of her. It's just following her along as she tries to work out her identity and her purpose and tries to fall in love and have someone remember her and her place in the world with this curse that she has to deal with. Yeah, I feel like most people have read this book by now, but it is still one of the most wonderfully written, emotional love stories that I've ever read, and I love it. Next, we have Under the Same Stars by Libba Bray, and this is being released also in February, I believe at the beginning of February. This was gifted to me by Fierce Reads, so thank you to them. And I also just read this book in my last reading vlog. This is a young adult historical fiction book that follows 3 different time periods. There are characters during World War II in Nazi Germany, characters in West Berlin with the Soviets, and then characters who are teenagers during the pandemic in New York City. And it is 3 different timelines and characters woven together by essentially their history. It was so beautifully written. It really reflects on each person's role and impact on the world, and how the things that we do and the choices that we decide to make can impact future generations down the line. I absolutely loved it. I would highly recommend checking out this book when it comes out in February. Next up, we have Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This is her adult fantasy series that she's been publishing for a few years now, and this is the first book in the series and my personal favorite right now. It is a dark gothic fantasy. It's set at Yale with this character called Alex Stern, who I think is one of the coolest characters ever, who is invited to Yale to be a part of this secret society, essentially, that there's a lot of very shady things that certain groups at Yale are partaking in, and Alex is supposed to be this sort of police force that monitors and makes sure that these different organizations aren't going too far. It is a very dark book. I would suggest, again, checking out trigger warnings. However, it was so much fun. It's a murder mystery. It has, like I said, gothic vibes. It has dark academia of being at Yale. The type of magic and fantasy world was just very unique, and I loved it. Next, we have The Great Alone by Kristen Hanna. I read this book at the beginning of last year. It was one of the first books I read. I still think about it constantly. I think that this is a bit of an underrated opinion, but for me personally, my Kristen Hanna ranking is like The Nightingale and The Woman Tide, and then this is like my second favorite book. It is so beautiful. It is set in Alaska. It's about this girl and her family that essentially is forced to uproot themselves and move to Alaska to try and start a new life. It's just about this girl and how alone she feels in the middle of Alaska trying to survive. It is another family story. She lives with an abusive father. She really suffers from a lot of different different emotions, especially depression. It is so beautiful. I underlined so many quotes in this book, and I cannot wait to reread this book at some point soon because I think it is one of Kristen Hanna's best. Next up, because I cannot help talking about this series, is Legendborn and Bloodmarked, which are the first two books before Oathbound, which is on my TBR this winter. And I'm actually planning to reread both of these books right before the release of Oathbound. I read this series for the first time last year, and as much as I love it so much, I feel like I forgot a lot of the key details, and I really want to be fully immersed in this world when Oathbound comes out. So again, this is a young adult fantasy series. It is about Bree, who is this girl who has just suffered the loss of her mother, and she's dealing with a lot of grief. And as she goes to this new college that she really doesn't want to go to, she kind of gets thrown into this world of King Arthur's Knights, which is this secret society, very elite society that is able to do magic. It is just one of the most wonderful, fun, engaging young adult fantasy series. The representation of Bree being a Black female main character and the generational trauma as well as the ancestral magic that Tracy writes in this book, I think was so unique and I loved learning about. Yeah, I highly recommend this series if you can't tell. Next, to throw another romance in there, I would recommend Unloved by Peyton Kryn, which comes out on February 4th, and I had the absolute pleasure of reading the arc of this book, and I cannot wait to get my hands on a physical copy because I will be rereading and annotating as soon as possible. Unloved is the second book in this hockey romance series, and it follows Freddie, who is a ice hockey player who's struggling with his grades because of his learning difficulties, and then Ro, who ends up being his tutor. And it's really about the friendship between the two of them and how much they want to protect each other. Ro tries to do anything to boost Freddie's confidence and try to find different solutions to help him in school. And Freddie is really someone who struggles with his self-esteem and just feeling worthy enough to be loved. He's dealt with a lot of different trauma in his life and just feels constantly abandoned and like he has to put on this front for everyone in his life. I just love Freddie's character. Like, he is now one of my favorite male main characters. I wanted to wrap him in a little hug and protect him, and I think the way that Peyton wrote his emotions, again, I just love the way she writes male main characters who struggle with their mental health and their self-esteem. The romance was hot, it was tender, it was really emotional, and I loved it so much. Okay, the final book on my recommendation list is an Ember and the Ashes series. I've been seeing such a resurgence of this series lately, and I personally think it is wonderful to read in the fall or the winter or any time of year. It is one of my favorite young adult fantasy series that follows a very unique world where the main character is essentially pretending to be a slave to spy on the Empire. The characters in this book are so beloved to me. They were so unique. I loved the dialogue and commentary in this book on different power dynamics in the world, especially between the Empire and then the rebels that are trying to fight those in power. Helene in this series is one of my favorite characters. She's so complex, as are all of these characters. I would highly recommend this one. And that is it for this TBR and recommendations video. I hope that you found something that you like or are interested in. I tried to include obviously a lot of fantasy and romance books, but there are some historical fiction and fiction books that I think hopefully there's something for everyone. I cannot wait for this winter. I have so many good books on my TBR, and I'm really trying to prioritize rereading some of my favorite books. As much as I want to get through my physical TBR and and just all the books in the world that I want to read. I just love being back with my favorite characters and my favorite stories. So if you enjoyed this little TBR video, please feel free to comment and like this video and subscribe to see more bookish videos from me in the future. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye!